Okay, we've given everybody a couple extra minutes to join, so we will go ahead and kick it off. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for our webinar today. I'm Jessie Dominic, a member of our marketing team, and I'm going to get us started just with a couple of housekeeping items before I turn it over to Zach Moore, our product manager of security, and he will be discussing all things ransomware protection with you guys today. He has a great presentation prepared, but first, I just wanted to let you all know that this session is being recorded, and we will be following up with a copy of that recording later today. And second, please feel free to utilize the Q&A box at the bottom right of your screen. Post any questions that you may have throughout the session, and we will address them at the very end. With that, that's all I had. So Zach, I will hand it over to you.
Sounds good. Thank you. All right. Welcome all, and thank you for joining me on this webinar, A Tale of Two Incidents. Things go wrong versus when things go RPaaS. My name is Zach Moore, and I am the product manager for security at InterVision. During the course of my career here, I have led our internal security operations center, helped stand up most of our current managed security services catalog, and led efforts on multiple incident response engagements against ransomware and other cyber attacks. More recently, I am also a member of the team that developed InterVision's Ransomware Protection as a Service offering, or RPaaS. One thing I've noticed is that when introducing new people to RPaaS, they will occasionally leave out that important P for protection, and will refer to our RPaaS offering as ransomware as a service. But ransomware as a service is something completely different. On the dark web, there are organizations where malicious software developers sell easy mode exploit kits designed to allow criminals with little to no cyber operations experience to launch large-scale ransomware campaigns with just a few simple button clicks. These ransomware as a service providers come with knowledge bases, Advisement, and 24/7/365 customer service call centers, just like any regular business. All to make it easier for potential bad guys to go out and start holding legitimate businesses and personal data for hostage. The InterVision Ransomware Protection as a Service offering is designed to combat ransomware as a service. Where the bad guys want to make it easier to launch attacks, InterVision wants to make it easier to detect, prevent, respond to, and recover from those attacks. With that in mind, I'd like to tell you a pair of stories. The first involves a cybersecurity incident at a company that is using a combination of in-house tools, do-it-yourself, and managed services from disparate providers for detection and response. The second is the same incident, the same company, but this time they're using RPaaS to protect them against cyber attacks. The timeline of events in both cases is fabricated due to the sensitive nature of these sorts of incidents, but every action taken and the measure of every cost, delay, and outcome is based on actual incidents we've worked through in our many years delivering security monitoring, disaster recovery, and incident response services. So without further ado, let's dive in. Both of our tales start at the same place and the same time, in the Company X server room at 10 p.m. on the Friday night before a 3-day holiday weekend. This is a common theme with cyber attacks. Bad actors like to launch large-scale campaigns at times when security and IT staff are likely to let their guard down. Both of these stories begin with a foreign IP remotely logging into a web-facing system with a local user's credentials. Within minutes, the compromised user account is executing PowerShell scripts to bypass local protections. And then these stories follow a successful breach, past perimeter protection by malicious actors based on phish credentials from an employee at Company X. What comes after the breach is where our two tales diverge. So let's start with our first story, when things go wrong, or how insufficient incident response preparation can put your business at risk. For this story, Company X, as we discussed, relies on a disparate array of tools, DIY engineering, and one-off outsourced services for detection, response, and recovery. Well, diving into this incident, we're going to explore some of the pitfalls that InterVision has worked with clients to recover from as part of our many years of incident response experience. The RPaaS service is specifically designed to mitigate or eliminate these gaps, but RPaaS isn't in the picture in this tale. So, where are we? Bad guys have breached a web-facing server and are busily trying to compromise the Company X environment. Let's explore our first incident and find out what the Company X's IT response was. Crickets. The answer, unfortunately, is that there was no response. Maybe Company X didn't have a SIM or security information event management system to monitor for compromises. Maybe they had one, but it wasn't configured correctly. Maybe these external logins didn't trigger an alert because they used legitimate credentials and the SIM wasn't smart enough to look for anomalies. Maybe an alarm was successfully raised, but nobody was monitoring for alerts outside of business hours. Maybe an alert did make it to someone's email or phone, but they were out partying for the holiday, or were asleep, or weren't checking their messages. All of these are common circumstances we discover when evaluating new and potential clients for RPaaS. Unfortunately, they're also some of the most common circumstances we see when we're brought in to handle incident response, helping customers pick up the pieces after a successful attack. For the purposes of this story, however, there was a SIM, and there was alerting, but the alerts were set to go to the head of IT, and they were on a beach on an island halfway around the globe, sipping Mai Tais and enjoying some of their hard-earned holiday PTO. Their work phone, which would have been blowing up had it been powered on, was sitting next to their employee ID on a dresser back home. The attackers didn't know any of this. All they knew was that they had made it through the door, and so far, nobody had tried to kick them out. With free reign of the Company X network, they got to work, seeing how much damage they could do before someone noticed. The answer was, unfortunately, a lot. With all the time in the world to work, the attackers were able to first disable local endpoint protection and start scouting network-attached devices. Based on DHCP settings, they were quickly able to locate a domain controller and start working on it. It took over an hour by the team of attackers, but eventually they found an exploit kit that got them access to the Active Directory server. From there, it was all over. A few privilege escalations later, they had domain admin access to the whole network, and they were able to use DNS and DHCP records to locate every server and endpoint of import at Company X. Soon, the bad guys had complete control of the environment, and nothing short of a miracle was going to displace them. Now, if RPaaS had been in place, the attack would have been quickly identified by our 24/7/365 team of experts, and the associated machine would have been cut off from the network to prevent lateral movement, reducing the mean time to detect and contain from hours to minutes would have limited the scope of intrusion and simplified response and recovery efforts. This isn't the RPaaS story, however, and these protections weren't in place. Time passed. It was now Saturday morning, 11 hours after the initial intrusion. The first sign that something was wrong for the employees of Company X came when members of the weekend staff began to arrive at various sites and started to turn on their computers for what was expected to be a busy Saturday. Users first noticed a few errors popping up, warning of problems connecting with network drives or domain-driven services that weren't working. And then this message started to appear. Oops, your files have been encrypted. Confused sales and manufacturing staff across all 8 campuses wondered what to do. Without access to their computers, they couldn't get to the corporate directory to look up the IT on-call number. Workers called management, and their managers called their managers, and multiple members of the IT staff were called in on an emergency basis to investigate. The head of IT on PTO was reached via their personal cell phone, but had no access and no visibility to coordinate. If RPaaS had been in place at this point, the dedicated vCISO would have been acting as the incident response coordinator, directing the actions of the SOC, the recovery, and IT teams, as well as assisting with interacting with legal, law enforcement, insurance, or whoever else was needed. This is an RPaaS story, however, so instead, Company X saw panic, confusion, and delays in a disaster declaration that led to even more workstations being brought online and taken hostage. By the time the first IT person got on site to investigate, it had been 13 hours since the initial compromise. Soon, people were running office to office at each location, shouting to everyone on site, "Don't turn on your computer, don't turn on your computer." Managers were stationed at the front door of each site, or stopping anybody not with IT from entering the buildings. Employees milled about in parking lots, asking questions that nobody had answers to. Are we still getting paid for today? Do I still have a job? Is Company X still in business? C-level executives were calling the 5 members of the core IT staff on their personal cell phones constantly for updates, as those members rushed back and forth trying to make sense of what was happening. Even the single help desk techs that worked at each of the non-HQ sites were being pushed for updates. Confused customers were calling into dead phone lines because the company phone servers weren't working. Company website showed a 404 error. Chaos abounded. Company X had a disaster recovery plan. It was based on natural disasters. Nobody had a plan to deal with ransomware. It was another 2 hours before the CFO thought to check on their cyber insurance provider and pulled a number for their emergency service from their website. Meanwhile, IT staff began consoling into servers and confirmed the worst. The intruders had encrypted everything. Active Directory, ERP, accounting, file servers, all gone. Even the SIM server, which had been collecting logs to monitor for this exact type of situation, had been ransomed. So there was no visibility on how the original compromise had started. When the offsite backups hosted at a nearby data center by another company were checked, they were found to be compromised as well. There was nothing left and panic deepened. Business hours for Saturday came and went, but this was now recognized as a full-blown disaster, and nobody from the IT staff was going home. The head of IT booked an emergency flight on the company dime to fly home less than 48 hours after starting their vacation. The cyber insurance provider had recommended an incident response firm, and the finance exec quickly gave them carte blanche to do whatever it took to get Company X up and running again. If RPaaS had been in place, the backups would have been put in immutable storage so that they could not be changed under any circumstances, preventing them from being compromised alongside the rest of the environment. Replication would have been paused at the first sign of trouble by the 24/7/365 recovery operations team to make sure that healthy recovery points were maintained. Critical SIM logs would have been stored in a separate cloud platform so that they could be examined by experts at the start of, during, and after the compromise. All the tools needed to analyze and restore from the ransomware attack would have been put in place, and all processes would have been tested and documented in an incident response plan well ahead of time. RPaaS wasn't in place for this incident, however, and the Company X IT staff found themselves in the frying pan, nowhere to go but the fire. At great expense, IT contractors and incident response staff were brought in to work 24/7. Because they were coming into the environment blind, there were several days worth of ramp-up time before real action started happening. Software was slowly deployed to compromised endpoints and servers to see what could be saved or what information could be gleaned. But the ransomware had already done its damage, and there was no discoverable data on how the attackers got in without the SIM logs. All of this work was done under the constant scrutiny of the board, the exec team, insurance, legal, and even now law enforcement. The idea of paying the multi-million-dollar ransom was floated early, but the incident response team and the law enforcement contacts advised that this should be a last resort or not considered at all. Only 8% of ransoms paid, they advised, result in a full recovery by the affected company. And paying ransoms both finances future attacks and makes your business a future target for malicious actors now that they know that you'll pay out. For Company X, the only non-network attached backups still available were old tapes from half a year ago. That's 6 months worth of customer orders, account information, manufacturing data, and more that would have to be rebuilt from scratch, if it could be rebuilt at all. Still, 6-month-old data was better than nothing, it was decided. And so the IT staff started looking at how to restore from the old tapes. They ran into an immediate brick wall with their recovery attempt, however, because their data center was now a crime scene. They didn't have equipment to restore to. Had RPaaS been in place, there would have been a pre-built disaster recovery landing zone in place, ready to restore to in the case of a disaster, natural, man-made, or caused by a cyber attack. This landing zone would be air-gapped and account-gapped, separating it from the main network to prevent it from becoming compromised in the case of a cyber incident. For this tale, the customer didn't have RPaaS, so they found themselves stuck with old data and nowhere to put it. Meanwhile, the customer still couldn't reach them, and their business was effectively shut down until further notice. New servers were purchased, but thanks to short notice and the chip shortage, the cost was extreme. It was weeks before the main server infrastructure was rebuilt in an adjacent data center space, and a month before Company X started doing anything close to business as usual. It was 2 months before the majority of the Company X end-user workstations were reimaged. From the alerts that initially went out, it was known that there was a compromised account, and it was known when the attack was started. But due to the fact that the SIM server was compromised during the incident, there was a lack of log data available from during the attack. This meant that it wasn't possible to tell which account was originally compromised, how the server was initially accessed, how the attacker moved laterally once inside the environment, or whether any new backdoors or time bombs had been left to reinfect the environment. Because of the lack of solid information, the IR team recommended upgrading network devices on the Company X perimeter, password resets globally, segmenting the Company X network, and a large number of other general security policy changes. Implementing these recommendations came with an enormous price tag and slowed the recovery efforts substantially. But without any event data from during the attack, the only way to make sure that all entry and re-entry points were closed was mass changes to everything all at once. If RPaaS had been in place, the dedicated VCISO, or Chief Information Security Officer, would have recommended many of these updates and policy changes well before the attack ever happened. Their deeper level of understanding of the environment coming into the incident would have also sped up response and recovery efforts. It's entirely possible that, had Company X put appropriate stopgaps in place ahead of time based on VCISO advisement, the attack would have been prevented entirely. This isn't the RPaaS story, however. In the end, insurance footed the bill for a large portion of the cost of recovery. But Company X still ended up paying several $1 million in overtime and new equipment purchases, notification to customers, tracking down orders based on third-party payment data, and they saw a drastic increase in their cyber insurance premiums. In the months following the attack, all but 2 junior help desk employees from the Company X IT staff quit, citing burnout and a lack of faith as their primary motivators for leaving. Thanks to the downtime and all the lost order and account information, customer satisfaction numbers for Company X fell to the lowest they had ever been, and Company X saw a 30% hit in share prices as the public reacted to the results of the incident. It was years before Company X saw their customer volume return to the level it was at before the attack. Luckily, in this case, the attackers had only ransomed Company X computers rather than exfiltrating sensitive customer data and personally identifying information. So there were no class action lawsuits, just a major drop in customer volume and share price, the loss of most of the Company X IT staff, and an outstanding bill for several $1 million worth of recovery efforts. And thus, our first story ends with a multi-month-long grind down the road to recovery and years of catch-up after. Cautionary tale indeed. Let's move on to our second story and see how RPaaS could have turned the tide in the same situation. We're back in the server room of Company X, 10 p.m. on a Friday night before a holiday weekend to prepare for our second tale. A foreign IP had successfully logged into a web-facing server with compromised user credentials, and PowerShell scripts were being run. This time, however, Company X was protected by the full Ransomware Protection as a Service suite, and InterVision was leading the charge on detection, response, and recovery efforts. Thus begins our second tale, Life Under RPaaS, or How the Full Ransomware Protection as a Service suite reacted in a crisis. Just as a reminder, the timing of the events from both these stories and the actions taken by the RPaaS team here are all based on the details of real incidents that the InterVision team has been called in to respond to. That in mind, let's see what happens. It was 10 p.m. at night and the attackers had breached the gates. Luckily, RPaaS provided the security alarm. Via the Managed Detection and Response component of our Security Operations Center as a Service piece, despite the timing of the attack, the unusual login activity was automatically flagged as anomalous and interesting by 10:05 p.m. and was escalated to a 24/7/365 triage team for review. By 10:25, investigation by the triage team determined that the server had been compromised with a high degree of confidence. Per the RPaaS pre-built and tested incident response playbook for the client, the SOC proactively used their endpoint agent to isolate the server from the network in order to cut off the attacker's access and to prevent lateral spread. Thanks to this quick reaction, the breach of Company X was effectively ended within half an hour of its start. Our story could end here with the threat contained, and for many security service providers, it would. InterVision understands that defense in depth is critical, however, and not all attacks will be stopped at the gates, so the RPaaS story continues. With the initial threat contained, the SOC triage team then begins the process of escalation. A full incident workup with remediation recommendations was delivered to the vCISO Go team by 10:28 so that they could organize the incident response. At the same time, the SOC began contacting client admins according to the pre-built and tested incident response playbook. The first contact on the escalation list, the head of IT, didn't answer. If you recall from the first story, they were on vacation, didn't bring their work phone. Escalation efforts weren't stymied there, though. Per the IR playbook, the SOC team contacted the next point of contact instead, and thus the response play continued unimpeded. By 10:40, the vCISO was working with the client contact to discuss options. Due to potential legal and forensic considerations, it was decided to leave the isolated, compromised server in place, cut off from the network, for potential post-mortem investigation. Based on vCISO recommendations, the user whose account was compromised had their password changed, and the RPaaS resiliency was brought in to begin the recovery process. At 10:57, it was decided to follow the standard DR playbook and restore the 40 terabyte server to an air-gapped cloud landing zone from an immutable data repository recovery point that had been created by InterVision backup processes 1 hour before the compromise began. Per the pre-tested procedures in the playbook, the restored server was first scanned for signs of compromise before being connected to the network. From the time the recovery team received their green light to the point when the newly created and verified safe instance of the server was brought into production, only 10 short minutes elapsed. As of 11:07, just 67 minutes after the bad actor initially gained access, the compromised server had been isolated from the network for future forensic review. The server instance created from backup was online, in production, and confirmed clean. The account that had originally been phished had been remediated. Here is the second point at which we could reasonably end our second story. But RPaaS is designed to cover all 5 pillars of the Nist cybersecurity framework: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. Cybersecurity is a life cycle, with constant testing and improvement necessary at all stages in order to keep up with the ever-changing threat landscape, and thus the RPaaS journey still continued onward. In the days following the attack, the InterVision vCISO dedicated to the client account analyzed the incident and, as part of the ongoing process of helping mature the client's security posture, made several targeted recommendations, such as geofencing firewalls, disabling PowerShell via group policy, implementing multi-factor authentication, and deploying a security awareness program to help make it harder to phish credentials from end users. Many of these changes had already been discussed and roadmapped in prior vCISO advisement sessions, but extra prioritization was given to them now due to the active nature of the associated threats. Not only did ransomware protection as a service utilize our tried and true processes to effectively relegate a successful compromise by bad actors into little more than a server connectivity hiccup, but the client environment came out of the incident hardened against future attacks. And that was that. Thanks to the ransomware protection as a service, our second story turned out much differently than our first. InterVision's sophisticated array of people, processes, and technology working behind the scenes minimized the client's impact in the face of a potential breach situation. That kind of quick, coordinated reaction is what you can expect from the RPaaS service, where we leverage our expertise to keep our clients safe. Having seen both ways the initial breach situation could have turned out, now is a good time to reflect on the difference between the two incidents. With RPaaS, the original breach was quickly identified and the compromised device was isolated. The speed of this response prevented lateral spread further into the Company X environment and prevented a single compromised device from taking down the rest of the network. To build the same level of 24/7/365 monitoring in-house with redundancy like RPaaS, according to Gartner, would require 8 to 12 dedicated security engineers and would likely cost $1+ million in annual salary alone. To run with fewer people leaves gaps, and gaps, as we saw, are what the malicious actors look for in order to compromise your environment. On top of the cost of people, if you don't have the right platform with the right development resources behind it, you may not identify the important events, and you may be staring at a blank alarm panel while clever intruders wreak havoc on your network behind the scenes. Going past monitoring defense, due to the existence of targeted phishing and zero-day vulnerabilities, even the most secure environment can be compromised. Sometimes, quick detection of threats isn't enough because those threats are either fast-moving or well-hidden. A great example of this is the recent string of attacks by the ransomware strain Black Basta. This strain uses unique binaries for each organization it hits, designed to target those individual organizations in order to bypass endpoint protection while quickly proliferating through the ecosystem. We've seen this strain breeze past top-of-the-line endpoint detection and response tools. In this case, the fate of your business may reside solely upon the resiliency of your resiliency. Company X in our first story saw what could happen when your backup and disaster recovery planning isn't up to snuff. RPaaS utilizes immutable backups that are constantly monitored for issues, a disaster recovery playbook that is tested regularly and has plays specifically designed for addressing cyber attacks, and an air-gapped DR landing zone to ensure that good backups are available, a working restore plan is in place, and there is somewhere to restore to in a crisis. This is often the difference between a few minutes or hours for data restoration versus a month-long slog to rebuild everything. Zooming even further out, security, compliance, and risk advisement is key. Regular security consultation by industry experts will not only help to identify where you are now, but will also help to roadmap the journey to where you need to be in order to stay safe. This will not only save you time when responding to incidents, but will also help to prevent many of those incidents in the first place by allowing you to harden your environment ahead of time. Company X in the first story was unprepared and paid the cost with long delays to recovery efforts and having to implement critical security changes on an emergency basis while in the midst of navigating a crisis. These delays lead to monetary and business costs. The key to keeping your business safe is security and defense in depth. InterVision's Ransomware Protection as a Service is built to provide that right mix of people, process, and technology to help you identify the gaps in your environment, to protect against threats, to detect all attacks against you, to quickly respond to those attacks, and to help you to recover when all else fails. Don't get caught unprepared, get RPaaS. Thank you for listening to my stories, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach. I'm not seeing any questions quite yet in our Q&A box, but we can give everyone another minute or so to see if any questions come in. Otherwise, we can give people a little bit of time back in the day.
Absolutely.
Okay, last call for any questions, anyone?
On the stories, on RPaaS, or about InterVision, I'm happy to answer anything.
And we do, just a reminder, we do have we will have the recording once it has processed, and so I will be sure to get that out later today. We do have one question. Thanks, Kevin. Kevin said that you rocked it, Zach. We have a question: is RPaaS a fit for customers that have had an incident in the past, even if it's already been remediated?
Absolutely. We offer incident response services as well, and a lot of the things that we recommend, putting 24/7 by 365 monitoring in place, improving your backup and disaster recovery posture, and all of the different security maturation and advisement options that come through vCISO. All of these are things that come packaged with RPaaS. So if we do an incident response with you, if you have incident response with someone else, a lot of the changes that they recommend are already built into the RPaaS service. So if you've had an incident, absolutely bring in RPaaS after and help stitch up your environment and close those gaps.
Follow-up question to that: does it cover cloud infrastructure as well?
Absolutely. Can do cloud monitoring, can do cloud-to-cloud backup, can advise on cloud security status as well.
Awesome. I think that's it in terms of questions. I do see, Joe, I do see your request, and we will be sure to get someone in touch with you. Other than that, I think you pretty much, oh, one more, just kidding, two more questions. Can I use my existing tools, or will you replace them?
We can consume existing EDR systems if they are top of the line. So if we come into an environment and you've got Kaspersky, we'll probably recommend an upgrade, which we can provide, or you can provide yourself. The SIM system, the SOC, the recovery software, all of that are things that we will provide using our best in breed technology and things that plug into our systems. But we will, as part of the process of scoping and building out everything for you, we will look at things like contract end dates and compatibility and see what we can fit in, and we'll help you on the RPaaS journey. We have something called a la carte to RPaaS, which basically, let's say you have a SIM service you're contracted for the next 6 months, and then you've got a data center where your lease is up in 11 months. We could get vCISO Advisement in the door today to help you start maturing that security posture. We can be ready in 5 months, a month before your contract ends, to start moving into our SIM service and get our SOC monitoring environment. And then we can start transitioning you in 10 months, a month before your data center is up, start transitioning you into our DRaaS system. So it's by no means something where you have to sign up for all the pieces all at once, all up front. We'll work with you to get you in there on our schedule.
Awesome. And one more question did come through. What percentage of ransomware incidents are the result of end user workstations or local administrator access?
User credentials, if I recall correctly from reading through some of the Verizon and IBM data breach reports that they publish yearly, I think end user credentials are involved in something like 60 to 70%. I don't think that directly impacts local admin access. I would have to dive into some data breach reports for that. Feel free to schedule a contact with us and ask those questions, and we can absolutely do the research and have answers for you.
I was going to be very impressed if you could just pull that stat out of your back pocket, but nicely handled. I believe that is all of the questions. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us. I will say once again, we are recording the session. We'll be sure to get that out to you. And thank you for your participation and engaging with us from questions. And thank you, Zach, for a great presentation.
Absolutely. Thank you all for your time. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.